Nanotyrannus by Richard L. Elsliger. Copyright 2024. Ben Irwin had over 200 hours of flight time logged on the sailplane, a frivolous purchase, but one that remained an unshakable aspiration from his childhood that he traced directly to the time his uncle showed him how to make a paper airplane. The probate of his uncle's California estate made Ben Irwin a multimillionaire to include his uncle's house in Newport Beach. Once he assumed the reins of his newfound fortune, he held no reserve for pursuing an exorbitant lifestyle, a lifestyle hitherto unknown to him. Gliding was leisure sport for the rich, a station in life that before his inheritance seemed insurmountable, unachievable. A celebratory vacation appeared in order, and he arranged transport of his sailplane by boat, the wings taken down and stowed alongside the fuselage. The trip along the Pacific coast was arduous, but once docked at port, Ben Irwin executed on his plan. Now he flew high over the Andes Mountains, riding the winds and catching thermals, aiming his sailplane toward the heavens and gliding for miles over magnificent terrain. The sun shone bright through the bubble canopy, raising the inside temperature. Ben cracked the window vent, and a cool gust rushed inside, swirling and aerating the cockpit. A yaw string taped to the forward portion of the plexiglass canopy fluttered in the slipstream, pointing upward to the 12 o'clock position, providing Ben with constant input to maintain correct angle of flight. Ben used the pedals and joystick with confidence, turning the plane into a corkscrew loop, gaining altitude from a thermal, while the onboard computer beeped a rapid pulse, giving auditory confirmation that Ben Irwin was rising even higher on the next convection of air. A sudden bump on the fuselage nudged the sailplane upward, and together he and his glider soared to greater heights. Beneath him, the peaks of the Andes Mountains frowned like hostile spectators, furious at his departure away from the majestic beauty of their peaks. The jagged and angry relief stood in contrast to the softer, more inviting jungle valley below. Ben got on the joystick and veered away from the mountains and adjusted his altitude downward to view the luscious foliage of the Peruvian tropical canopy below. Ben imagined the rare and exotic birds and parrots that lived in the jungle, the amazing and exotic colors of birds, strange mammals and reptiles indigenous to the area. He spiraled downward in silence, bringing the nose lower, moving closer to get a choice view of the jungle. Only the rush of wind through the canopy window provided a steady white noise to accompany the intermittent beeps of the navigation system, advising him of his gradual loss of altitude. He brought the glider down to a quarter-mile distance from the treetops, the topography moving ever faster beneath him like the raging current of a flowing river. He felt a shudder travel through the plane, and the altitude dropped fast. Cold spot, he thought, watching the trees come up toward him with leafy, contorted arms, now threatening to pluck him and his plane right out of a clear blue sky. Ben flipped a red starter button, and a large electric propeller emerged from the bodywork of the plane. He watched the propulsion system appear in the rearview mirror and hit the engage button with a smile. A spark shot out from the button and stung his hand. He hit the engage button again, and nothing happened. He checked his mirror for ignition, but the propeller only spun lackadaisically in the airstream. He hit the button 2 more times in frustration. A fear seethed and writhed inside him that this might not end well. He adjusted the rudder pedals to keep the yaw string pointed up and finessed the joystick, dipping the nose to gain some speed. He pulled up on the stick and began to stall. Ben's eyes grew large, 2 orbs of fear staring back at him. The useless electric fan behind him acted more as a drag on the plane, thus imperiling the flight all the faster. He hit the button to retract the electric fan, but it failed to respond. The treetops raced beneath Ben, and a sinking feeling clawed at the pit of his stomach. He needed to find a clearing, and damn fast. He detected an opening in the jungle canopy, but could he reach it in time? His mind raced a flurry of various scenarios, each outcome more grim than the prior. The various outcomes paraded through his mind like the still frames of a horror movie. He pulled on the landing gear. He pulled on the joystick. The sailplane skimmed the treetops, branches cracked beneath the cockpit. Then the clearing opened up in plain view. He maneuvered the nose and activated the air brakes. The sailplane slowed and glided like a well-folded piece of paper. Ben surveyed the land. The terrain looked rough, and he braced for landing. The sailplane bounced off the ground and then touched down on a gentle bed of tall grass. Ben came to a jarring halt, the grass scrubbing airspeed and slowing the glider. The onboard navigation system let out a steady, flat-line hum. Ben shut off his instrumentation, frustrated that he'd been so careless to lose altitude and ditch. "Damn electric motor. You just had to quit on me, didn't you?" He unlatched the canopy and pushed up on the dome. The steamy jungle air hit him in the face like a sledgehammer. He stepped out onto a field of grass that swallowed him up to his knees. Ben surveyed the area. Beyond the clearing was thick jungle, and behind him were the imposing Andes in the distance. He paused to listen, appreciative of the wild and untamed nature that enveloped him and his plane, but he had work to perform. Ben reached into the cockpit and removed a toolkit. He opened the box and removed a flat-tipped screwdriver, then unlatched the side panel of the fuselage. He tossed the panel to the grass and it landed in silence, gently absorbed by the spongy character of the field. He examined the battery pack and turned on the positive and negative terminals with his hands. The negative cable came off in his right hand. A chalky residue coated the battery terminal. Ben wiped away the chalk and blew on the remaining dust, scattering the particles to the four winds. "Bad ground," he said. His eyes caught some movement from the periphery, and Ben Irwin snapped his head around to see. The motion came from the jungle. He paused. He scanned the trees. A flock of multicolored parrots went airborne and scattered. He wondered if he might trap one or two and bring them back stateside as pets. Maybe later. He removed a half-inch wrench and put it to work on the bolt, tightening the cable onto the post to re-establish a ground connection. The mast and electric fan retreated within the bodywork of the plane, obeying the memory of the last command before the connection failed. Ben returned to the cockpit and hit the start button to raise the mast and test the electric fan. The mast rose up from the fuselage and he hit the start. The fan turned several cranks, then froze. A red light flashed on the navigation screen of his computer. Low battery. "How stupid am I?" asked Ben. He'd neglected to charge the battery before the flight, and this small oversight put him here, stranded in an area unfamiliar to him, far away from civilization. Sweat rolled down his cheeks, and he wiped it away with the sleeve of his shirt. The sun beat down hard, and he could feel the oppressive heat already sapping his strength. He picked out the canteen from behind the seat of the cockpit and took a gulp of water. He wanted to drink it all, but restrained himself, thinking he might be stuck for a while. He walked away from the sailplane to assess the viability of a short takeoff under the power of the electric motor, assuming he would be able to get the motor started. The tall grass swayed in the wind, soft and pliant. The grass provided a certain buoyancy, perhaps sufficient to stabilize the wings, yet provide minimal drag to allow him to become airborne. It might further help if he retracted his landing gear, making the underbelly smooth. The sailplane would slide more readily over the grass, given less resistance. He walked a good 100 feet ahead of the plane, and the grass provided no dips or irregularities, only a slippery bed of green, offering little resistance for takeoff. This could work. But he had no battery juice. Ben removed a secondary panel on the aircraft and rolled out a set of photovoltaic cells, enough area he hoped to capture the rays of the sun and recharge the low battery. He unfurled the panels and laid them over the grass. A red light came on, signaling that the panels were energized and providing current. He unraveled the charger cord and hooked up the alligator clips to the battery. He leaned on the aircraft as if posing for a photograph, then wiped away more sweat from his face. He looked up to the Andes Mountains and noted a series of clouds off in the distance. "You clouds stay over there and entertain the mountains," he said. "You're not welcome here just yet." Ben reached back for the canteen and took another swig of water. Something bumped his leg, and he recoiled. He looked down to see a creature, a strange lizard, he thought. It stood on its haunches, looked up at him with jaundiced eyes and a gaping mouth loaded with small but razor-sharp teeth. The body was olive green with large yellowish spots over the torso. It jumped up at him and snapped. Ben kicked it away, and the thing ran at him again. He kicked at it this time with sufficient force to knock it out. Ben put his canteen down and trained all of his attention to this persistent creature. He crouched to look at it. "That's no lizard," he exclaimed. It measured about 2 feet long from head to tail and stood about the height of a chicken, he estimated. 2 clawed arms tucked under its body, and the head told him that he'd seen this creature before, but only its skeletal form and only in the paleontological section of a museum. He'd played with the plasticized versions of this thing as a kid. He'd watched all of the popular movies where the creature made an A-list appearance, then proceeded to tear the place apart. But how was it possible that for the first time he looked down at one in living form? Was it the product of a freak experiment? Were the movies really telling the truth, art imitating life? A stinging ripple of fear coursed through his body, an instant reckoning that if there was a small one, a much larger one might be close to his proximity. Ben picked up his wrench and gave a poke at the thing. "I thought you went extinct." The theropod perked up, regained its balance, and snarled at him. Ben went to poke at it again, and the theropod scuttled off, disappearing between the tall blades of grass. "This isn't good," he said. Ben directed his pale blue eyes once more beyond the serene field of grass to the jungle, sensitive for any movements. He squinted from the intensity of the sunlight and paused to take in a wide field of view. He listened and waited. Only the exotic chirps of birds native to the area intermingled with other less recognizable sounds. The occasional low-level grunt of a wild mammal broke up the monotony, yet nothing signaled the alarm of anything dangerous. He returned his attention to the sailplane and repositioned the solar panels to an optimal location, away from the shade of the fuselage. He unbuttoned his shirt to let the gentle winds dry the perspiration that coated his body. The heat baked his head, and he put on a baseball cap to counteract the intensity of the sun. He sat in the tall grass next to the sailplane, angling for shade. Ben started to drift off from the overbearing humidity, his mental strength depleted. By degrees, he closed his eyes and began to dream a nightmarish scene, trapped on a plane with failing engines, dropping out of the sky at 30,000 feet, banging on the cabin to get the pilots to do something, passengers screaming while the plane performed barrel rolls, the airframe stressed beyond the structural integrity of the wings. Ben writhed in his sleep. A shriek pierced the calm air, and he awoke to sharp pain like a bullet entering his leg. The olive-colored theropod had returned, and it bit hard, cutting through Ben's cotton cargo pants. He swatted the creature, and it ran off on 2 powerful little legs, then stopped and turned at a distance outside striking range to watch. The theropod tilted its head and stared at Ben, curious about this human invader. Then Irwin grabbed at his quadriceps and stained his hands from a consistent stream of blood trickling down his leg. It ached, but he stood up to bear weight on the injured leg. He managed to balance himself and then took a run at the Nanotyrannus. The theropod ran fast, able to evade Ben's wrath. He threw a water bottle at the creature, nearly pegging the small tyrannosaur. "You little shit," he exclaimed, and grabbed his leg again. He reached for the first aid kit in the cockpit and removed some gauze to wrap the wound. He leaned on the cockpit and stared at the tyrannosaur, who watched him at a distance. "Any more of your friends around?" he asked. Ben reached into the cockpit and removed a flare gun and cracked the barrel. A single flare filled the barrel, and he snapped it shut. He took aim and pulled the trigger. A flash of red erupted from the muzzle and traced its way directly toward the Nanotyrannus, hitting its body, disintegrating the small theropod in a brilliant explosion. The tyrannosaur popped and sizzled. A cloud of smoke rose up from the body. Ben limped over to the charred remains and gave it a kick. A flock of birds ascended from the treetops and dispersed in all directions. He heard a low grunt from the direction of the jungle. He limped to the glider and removed a bandolier of 6 flares from behind the seat of his cockpit. He strapped the flares around his shoulder, reloaded the gun, and then waited. An hour slipped by, then 2. He checked the power level of the battery and saw a quarter charge on the screen, enough to get off the ground, but not enough to gain sufficient altitude to glide out of there to safety. He heard a rustling from the jungle, and his head spun. His eyes shifted side to side, absorbing the full field of green in his vision. He perceived movement amidst the tree roots in the distance and stood up. He thought he saw two more of the little tyrannosaurs emerging through the reeds. They advanced on Ben's position, bodies leaned forward and small arms dangling, mouths agape. Ben drew his flare gun, took aim, and launched a flare at one of them, hitting the target, incinerating the creature. The other made a retreat to the safety of the jungle and vanished. Then Irwin checked the power level again, and another bar appeared on the screen. His head ached and his surroundings spun in a centrifuge of motion. He needed to sit down. He groaned and backed himself toward the fuselage and leaned on the body of his glider. He put his hand to his forehead and wiped away sweat. A guttural, low-frequency rumble came from the jungle. Primal fear traversed every molecule of his body, and he staggered to the battery pack, ripping away the alligator clips that connected the solar panels. He stumbled to the cockpit and fell into his seat. He closed the canopy and locked it in place. He turned his attention to the jungle and saw the head of something massive make its presence known between the fronds of lush vegetation. No time to fasten the harnesses. Ben's eyes blazed in terror, fully focused on starting the engine. He hit the red button, raising the mast, and blasted the start button. The propeller made several revolutions, then stopped. He looked to his port side and saw a fully grown Tyrannosaurus thundering toward him. The monster was gargantuan, its pair of sickly yellow eyes trained upon him with stereoscopic forward-looking vision. The broad head measured 6 feet from front to back, connected to a thick neck of sinuous muscle. Its mouth hung open, exposing uncountable dripping 12-inch serrated teeth, thick as railroad spikes. The long tail swayed side to side as it ran with enormous strides, closing fast. Ben hit the start again. The propeller came to life and spun at half throttle. Ben pushed the lever to wide open and the engine hummed a confident cadence. The sailplane began to move over the grass, gaining speed. Ben looked to his aft and saw the Tyrannosaurus catching up. The thing was an olive-green mass of earth-shaking tonnage, lunging toward the plane. Ben pulled hard on the stick, desperate to leave the ground. The jarring ride over the grassy field smoothed out and he was away. The giant theropod shrank from the rearview mirror, and Ben cleared the treetops, soaring ever higher. He banked and turned, reaching greater levels of altitude, until he caught a thermal. He flipped on the instrumentation, and a steady beep verified his climb rate. A mile high, Ben felt a surge of dread overwhelm him. Fever raged throughout his body, and strange hallucinations entered his thoughts. His desire to leave behind the horror was quickly supplanted with an irresistible urge to go back and see the Tyrannosaur once more. He wiped away sweat from his eyes and squeezed on the bloody wound inflicted on his thigh. He moved the joystick to starboard, and his feet involuntarily adjusted the rudder pedals, pointing him back to the grassy field once more. A powerful obsession gripped his mind. He pointed the stick downward. The auditory beeps of his instrument cluster reflected his spiraling descent. He could see the field in range. A sense of elation filled his chest, a genuine excitement to meet the big Tyrannosaur and make peace with the creature. Fever consumed his mind, his body soaked with sweat, his brain swirled with manic thoughts, the rational mind of Ben Irwin banished to the inert parts of his rapidly decaying brain. The bacteriological infection had spread throughout, infiltrating every brain cell, reprogramming his every thought toward a fatal attraction. Ben landed in the field again, coming to rest in plain view of the massive Tyrannosaur he had left behind. The theropod saw the aircraft land and moved in Ben's direction. Now it towered over him, only the flimsy plexiglass of Ben's cockpit separating him from the gaping jaws. A powerful crunch shattered the plastic bubble, and Ben smiled. The overwhelming odor of rotten flesh filled his nose, and the hot breath of the prehistoric predator tousled his hair. Ben faced the monster with rapturous delight, once a thing of childhood nightmares, a thing he once knew only as a pile of fossilized bones, now a grim reality. The sizable jaws enveloped Ben Irwin, and darkness replaced light. His mind rejoiced, and his voice screamed, while blood ejected from all corners of his shredded flesh, and he listened with macabre fascination at the sound of his own cracking bones.